Hello, I'm Alexandra Bojowicz, and today I will speak to you about classroom preparation for a global world, exploring the effects of teaching Australian cultural knowledge and language learning motivation and intercultural communicative competence. So, let's get into it. First, I will give you a short overview or a sort of preview of what my research is about. My objective was to see if intercultural communicative competence, to which I will refer to as ICC from now on, had an effect when applied in the classroom on students' language learning motivation, their cultural knowledge of a particular area, as well as their self-assessed ICC, so whether they thought they had intercultural communicative competence. To test this, I taught 2 classes on Australian culture to students in Tarragona, Catalonia, Spain. Altogether, I taught 37 students. And what I found was that the inclusion of Australian culture in the classroom had a statistically significant and positive effect on students' language learning motivation and cultural knowledge about Australia, but that it had a statistically insignificant effect when it came to a student's self-assessed ICC, as in that students did not experience a difference in what they assessed their ICC to be pre and post intervention. They did to some extent, but not a statistically significant amount. Now let's take a look at some relevant terms. What is actually intercultural communicative competence? Well, Neuner explains it as an ability to understand ourselves and to understand the culture of others. And what I was interested in is whether building this understanding has a positive or negative effect of motivation, since there is an element of our own sense of self which is connected to culture, and this is connected to our language ego. And this could be negatively affected for ICC. Yet Brown talks about integrative motivation, which is the desire to be part of a culture, and here ICC is crucial. In instrumental motivation, which is our desire to use a language to complete a certain task, such as at work, in school, or even to be able to understand a book or movie, ICC can additionally have a positive effect as it makes pragmatic understanding easier at times. I chose Australian culture specifically because Australian culture is often underrepresented in the English classroom, and here I was hoping that that would minimize any sort of bias that students would be coming in with. But that leads us to the question, is intercultural communicative competence really necessary in the English language learning classroom? Well, although we can't separate culture and language in the teaching, intercultural communicative competence in particular is becoming more and more needed in the classroom and is already part of CFR requirements and has been in the past. We can see this if we look at the Council of Europe, where they say that their goal is to promote plurilingualism and cultural diversity. There is also reasons because of how a language is used today, especially English as a lingua franca, where we often have language as a medium of education. And here, students are expected to function in intercultural classrooms. They're expected to do so in intercultural professional environments with working as well. So we have cross-cultural competencies being named as some of the most crucial future work skills. Apart from that, students are faced with using the English when consuming information about different cultures online, when watching TV, and consuming different forms of media as well. And now, to reiterate, my first research question focused on whether the inclusion of Australian culture in the language learning classroom affected students' English language learning motivation. My second question wondered whether the inclusion of Australian culture affected students' self-assessed intercultural communicative competence. And finally, my third research question focused on whether the inclusion of an Australian lesson within English language learning affected students' cultural knowledge of Australia. We then move on to my methodology. I worked with 37 students from a half-private high school in Tarragona, Catalonia, Spain. Most of them spoke Spanish and Catalan as their first languages, while one spoke Serbian as their first language, but also spoke Spanish and Catalan, and one spoke Ukrainian, and then additionally Spanish and Catalan. This meant that the students were learning English as a foreign language. The class itself consisted of language of a language focus, that was a vocabulary focus on hobbies, which would have been part of their curriculum otherwise, and then culture as well. My goal was to include culture within the curriculum in a way that would not disturb what the students would otherwise be learning in the class. The class itself consisted of a presentation that was on cultural knowledge. The explicit teaching of culture was included since students lacked prior knowledge on Australian culture and commented on this in discussions. Additionally, there were texts used so that there was an inclusion of reading skills. There was a video used so that there was an inclusion of listening skills. And students were encouraged to answer a variety of questions during the presentation that fostered them seeing similarities and differences between their own culture and the culture of Australia. And by doing so, they were able to practice their speaking skills as well. When it came to motivation was tested by using a pre-questionnaire and then a post-questionnaire after the treatment. And what I found when comparing the results between the pre-questionnaire and post-questionnaire was that there was a general increase that was statistically significant among students' motivation for learning English as a foreign language. I had tested for different types of motivation, including questions for integrative and instrumental motivation, as well as task motivation. So whether students were interested in the actual activities in the classroom and whether they enjoy activities in the English language learning classroom. Student self-assessed ICC was primarily assessed using, again, a pre-questionnaire and post-questionnaire. And when it came to the comparison between these two results, we could see that there was an increase, but that this increase was not statistically significant. Although this is self-assessed ICC, so it is what students believe they would be able to do. In discussions, students did say that they found the inclusion of ICC interesting, and conversations about cultures in general, that they weren't particularly interested in Australian culture, but that the inclusion of culture could be interesting. And then finally, we have cultural knowledge. When it came to cultural knowledge, students did a pre-test and then a post-test, which included a variety of questions such as finding Australia on a map, recognizing the Australian flag, and so on. The results showed a statistically significant increase, meaning that their cultural knowledge, which is an aspect of ICC, had increased post-intervention. Now, when we look at descriptive statistics, we do realize that asking students to self-assess their ICC becomes a bit of a tricky question because they lack knowledge of what ICC is, and they might lack the ability to self-assess as well. So in some questions, we can see that the results of whether they thought they were able to do something that included cultural knowledge was in line with what they were able to do. For example, whether they were able to recognize the Australian flag, 30 of them said yes, 25 of them were actually able to do so. But when we look at other information, like whether they were able to find Australia on a map, we see that there's a very different result, and that many students who thought they would be able to actually were not able to. While when we look at post-intervention results, we see that there is a much better fit between the students who thought they would be able to do something and the students who were able to. So here, whether students thought they would be able to find Australia on a map and whether they were actually able to do so. And that does bring me to some limitations of my study. The study tested for self-assessed ICC, which can sometimes be a difficult request for students who do not have a concept of what intercultural communicative competence is. Additionally, the actual intervention was fairly short, which meant that students did not have the space to explore intercultural communicative competence in many different aspects. Instead, there was only a focus on cultural knowledge. In discussions, there was an attempt to have them recognize similarities and differences between cultures, but it was limited by time. Still, there were statistically significant results of this study that point to there being a positive effect of the inclusion of intercultural communicative competence. And even when it wasn't statistically significant, there was still a positive effect. To reiterate, the statistically significant effect was on students' motivation and cultural knowledge, but insignificant on students' intercultural communicative competence. Future studies can focus on whether students' ICC increases, but without including their self-assessed ICC, and rather using questionnaires that can assess ICC on its own. Additionally, longer interventions need to be tested to truly be, for us to truly understand how ICC falls into English language teaching. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time today.